Washington approved the sale. Then Washington taxed the sale. Same chip, same country, roughly the same month. If that sentence made you do a double take, good, because that's the only rational response to what happened with the H200 in December. And the fact that it didn't make bigger headlines says something unflattering about how numb we've all become to American semiconductor policy eating itself alive in public. Here's what actually occurred. The Biden administration, in its final weeks, updated export licensing rules in a way that permitted certain H200 GPU sales to China to proceed, not blanket approval, but within specific parameters, to specific buyers, under specific end-use conditions. NVIDIA had been navigating exactly this kind of regulatory maze for 2 years by that point. The H200 was already a downgraded product by design, deliberately hobbled in memory bandwidth to stay beneath Bureau of Industry and Security thresholds for controlled AI chips. It was, in the language of export control lawyers, compliant. Then, weeks later, the incoming Trump administration announced a 25% tariff on semiconductors falling into certain trade categories, and the H200, that same compliant, approved, deliberately weakened chip, landed squarely in the crossfire. So let's be precise about the situation: compliant enough to export, expensive enough to tariff, not powerful enough to restrict on national security grounds, but economically penalized anyway through a separate policy mechanism operated by a different part of the government that wasn't coordinating with the first part. This is not a story about mixed signals. Mixed signals imply there's a coherent signal somewhere underneath the noise. What this actually represents, and I want to stay precise here because vague language is what lets bad policy hide, is 2 separate policy architectures built by 2 separate coalitions inside the U.S. government, running on 2 entirely separate logics, applied simultaneously to the same physical object. The export control apparatus says, this chip is safe to sell. The trade war apparatus says, this sale should cost more. Neither apparatus is in conversation with the other, and NVIDIA is standing in the middle holding an invoice, a compliance certificate, and a tariff bill. The reason this matters extends well beyond one GPU. The H200 occupied a very specific regulatory position, powerful enough to be commercially meaningful to Chinese AI labs, constrained enough to technically pass export review. NVIDIA engineered it to live exactly in that gap. The company has done this repeatedly and systematically. The A800 and H800 were both purpose-built for the Chinese market after the original A100 and H100 got restricted in October 2022. Each time Washington published a new threshold, NVIDIA measured it and built a product that fit underneath the ceiling by a deliberate margin. That process isn't evasion. That's a company engineering to a specification the U.S. government itself wrote and published, which makes the subsequent tariff particularly difficult to defend because now Washington is financially punishing a product it technically approved, made by an American company, sold under American rules, generating American revenue and American tax receipts. The U.S. restricted China's access to advanced chips in 2022. Then forced NVIDIA to design a weaker product for the Chinese market, then approved that product, then made it more expensive. I'm not sure what the correct word for that sequence is, but strategy feels like a stretch. Now, we should be honest about what Chinese AI laboratories actually do with these chips, because the entire American justification for restriction rests on this question. The concern isn't running search algorithms or rendering graphics. The concern is training large foundation models, running inference at scale across millions of users, and potentially accelerating military AI applications that the Pentagon has explicitly flagged as a long-term threat vector. The BIS thresholds that define what's controlled are built around 2 specific technical metrics: peak flops, floating point operations per second, and memory bandwidth, specifically the interconnect speed between memory and compute. The H200 was architected to sit just below the controlled thresholds on both metrics. Whether that gap actually prevents meaningful AI capability development is, and I want to be honest here, a genuinely contested empirical question. Several engineers who've worked with both the H100 and H200 in production training environments have noted that the real constraint in large-scale model training isn't usually theoretical peak performance on a single chip. It's cluster size, interconnect speed between chips, and total memory capacity across the system. You can build a formidable training cluster with H200s if you have enough of them, and the right networking infrastructure EOS, and Chinese hyperscalers have both. ByteDance, Alibaba, Baidu, and Tencent have been accumulating H800 and H200 inventory since the moment each variant cleared export review. The aggregate compute those clusters represent is not trivial. Huawei's Cloud Matrix 384 system, which began commercial deployment in early 2025, demonstrated something important. Purpose-built Chinese interconnect solutions are closing the architectural gap that American export controls were designed to exploit. The Cloud Matrix links 384 Ascend 910C accelerators with Huawei's proprietary high-bandwidth fabric. In certain distributed inference workloads, it benchmarks within competitive range of comparable NVIDIA clusters. That doesn't mean the export controls accomplished nothing. It means the window they were designed to protect may be narrower than the policy documents assumed. I want to give the counter-argument its strongest possible form before I explain why the tariff still doesn't make sense on its own terms. The case for maintaining restriction, even on downgraded chips, runs like this. Any GPU that scales contributes to a training ecosystem. 10,000 H200s networked together can do things one H200 cannot. The marginal contribution of each additional chip matters when you're operating at the frontier of model scale. And once the hardware is sold, end-use verification becomes a compliance exercise on paper, not a physical reality. The export licensing framework depends on buyers truthfully declaring what they intend to do with the hardware, a standard that American intelligence assessments have explicitly said cannot be applied with confidence to certain categories of Chinese end users. That's a real argument. It has genuine weight. But here's the problem. The tariff doesn't advance that argument, not even slightly. A 25% tariff doesn't prevent the chips from reaching China. It doesn't add verification requirements. It doesn't strengthen end-use monitoring. It doesn't close any of the loopholes that export control critics have identified. What it does is make the chips more expensive, which marginally benefits Huawei's Ascend line by narrowing the price-performance gap against NVIDIA, and which increases the cost of doing legally approved, fully compliant business for an American company that followed every rule it was given. If the objective is national security, the tariff is categorically the wrong instrument. If the objective is trade leverage in a broader negotiation with Beijing, then the administration is using approved semiconductor exports as a bargaining chip, while simultaneously punishing the American company making those exports. And if the objective is industrial policy, pushing China toward domestic chip development, then the tariff accelerates exactly the outcome the export controls were supposed to prevent by making American chips less attractive relative to local alternatives. There's a number worth sitting with here. NVIDIA derived approximately 17% of its total data center revenue from China in fiscal year 2024, down from over 20% before the October 2022 restrictions. That's not a rounding error for a company whose market capitalization reached $3 trillion. Every regulatory adjustment that touches Chinese sales moves real money, real R&D budgets, real headcount decisions, real investment timelines for next-generation architectures. And every policy surprise that creates compliance uncertainty makes long-term investment planning harder, not just for NVIDIA, but for the entire ecosystem of American semiconductor designers that depends on predictable access to global markets. AMD is watching. Intel's accelerator division is watching. The smaller fabless designers building inference chips are watching. What they're all observing is a regulatory environment where a product can be approved and penalized in the same quarter by two different arms of the same government. That's not a compliance problem you can engineer around. That's a business environment where the rules change faster than the product cycles. Here's the human anchor in this story, the part that doesn't make the financial press, but probably should. Somewhere in NVIDIA's Government Affairs Division, there is a team of lawyers and policy analysts who spent the better part of 2023 and 2024 working through BIS documentation, meeting with Commerce Department officials, and designing the H200's technical specifications to stay within approved parameters. That work represents hundreds of hours and millions of dollars of compliance investment by a company that was genuinely trying to operate within the rules as written. The tariff announcement rendered a portion of that work economically obsolete without changing a single line of the export control framework those lawyers were navigating. The rules didn't change. A different set of rules, operated by a different agency, arrived on top of the first set. That's the texture of what American semiconductor policy actually feels like from inside the industry right now. The deeper structural problem, and this is the part I think most analysis of this situation misses, is that U.S. semiconductor policy is not a single policy. It's at minimum 3 separate policy projects that share a subject matter but not a goal. The National Security Project, centered at commerce and supported by the intelligence community, wants to deny China access to chips that could accelerate military AI. The Trade War Project, centered at USTR and with strong support from certain congressional factions, wants to use technology access as leverage in a broader economic negotiation with Beijing. The Industrial Policy Project, the one that produced the CHIPS Act and the Domestic Fab Investment Push, wants to build American manufacturing capacity and keep American companies globally competitive. These 3 projects point in different directions on almost every specific decision. Restrict aggressively, and you protect security but damage competitiveness. Tariff broadly and you gain leverage but hurt the American companies you're trying to strengthen. Subsidize domestic production while restricting exports, and you build capacity that can't fully monetize at global scale. China, watching all of this, has a much simpler policy. It wants domestic chip capability. Full stop. Every American restriction, every tariff, every supply chain disruption is processed through a single question. Does this accelerate or delay our own production capacity? The answer to the H200 situation, from Beijing's perspective, is that it marginally accelerates domestic development by making the American alternative less attractive, while providing additional political justification for the hundreds of billions of yuan flowing into SMIC, Huawei HiSilicon, and the dozens of smaller design houses that make up China's emerging chip ecosystem. SMIC's N+2 process node, which is producing at volume despite ASML export restrictions cutting off access to extreme ultraviolet lithography tools, represents something the export control framework didn't fully price in: the possibility that China could achieve meaningful production capability through a different technical path, using deep ultraviolet multi-patterning instead of EUV. It's slower. It's more expensive per wafer. The yields are lower, but it works, and the gap it represents is closing, not widening. My opinion on this: the H200 approval then tariff sequence is the most legible evidence yet that U.S. semiconductor policy isn't a policy in any coherent sense. It's a negotiation between at least 3 domestic factions that don't share an objective, periodically producing contradictory outputs that the industry then has to absorb. China is the 4th participant in this negotiation, and it's currently the only one operating from a unified strategic position. That asymmetry matters more than any individual chip approval or tariff announcement. My genuine doubt: I'm not certain that any version of export control policy, however well designed, can achieve its stated objective at this point in the technology trajectory. The controls were most powerful in 2020, when Chinese AI capability was further from the frontier and domestic alternatives were less developed. By December 2024, when this H200 situation unfolded, the window had already narrowed considerably. The counterfactual E, what Chinese AI capability would look like without any restrictions, is genuinely unmeasurable, which means the policy can always claim credit for whatever hasn't happened yet. That's a useful property for a policy, but it's not the same thing as evidence that it's working. My prediction, within 18 months, you'll see NVIDIA successfully advocate for a revised licensing framework, either a new compliant China market product positioned below whatever threshold BIS publishes next, or a formal trusted commercial buyer tier that allows sales to non-military Chinese entities under enhanced monitoring. The 25% tariff will either be negotiated down in a broader U.S.-China trade package or quietly carved out for American semiconductor companies specifically because the political cost of watching NVIDIA's China revenue collapse while Huawei gains share will eventually outweigh the trade leverage the tariff was supposed to provide. The underlying tension between American tech companies and American trade policy doesn't resolve. It migrates to a higher level of complexity, where the rules are more elaborate and the gaps are smaller, but still engineered to specification. The last thing worth saying is the quietest. Two branches of the same government approved and then financially penalized the same transaction in the same quarter, without apparent coordination. The chip that was safe enough to sell became expensive enough to reconsider. The company that followed every rule got handed a new cost by a different rulebook, and somewhere in Shenzhen, the people building the alternative to that chip looked at the situation, ran the numbers, and concluded that American semiconductor policy is doing more work for them than any investment they could make themselves. If you've been following how this unravels, the export control frameworks, the tariff architecture, the domestic Chinese alternatives closing the gap, this channel covers the full picture. Subscribe. The next contradiction is already in the pipeline.